Well, hello and welcome to Teaching African American History in the hashtag Black Lives Era, a roundtable at the Organization of American Historians 2021 virtual conference. The emergence of Black Lives Matter, a movement and organizing strategy created by activists favoring social media over traditional organizing entities like political parties, labor unions, and religious institutions, has presented new opportunities and challenges for educators. As our students take to the streets to demand justice and the right to live, teachers at all levels strive to place the movement within the context of the historical struggle for African American rights. Since we first proposed this roundtable, so much has changed, yet so much remains the same. The police murder of George Floyd last May proved that 6 years after Ferguson, for too many in our society, Black lives don't matter. The widespread protests which followed were used as political fodder by both sides in the 2020 election. And for the past 7 weeks, since Joe Biden defeated Donald Trump, for too many in our society, Black votes don't matter either. The discussants and moderator include educators at two historically Black universities, a research prime institution, a regional state teaching university, and a public high school, with scholarly interests within African American history that nevertheless vary by era and geographical region. Stanley Keith Arnold, Associate Professor of History at Northern Illinois University, has been teaching African American history since 1992 at urban community colleges, private liberal arts institutions, and research universities, and has participated in Black Lives Matter protests. Cheryl Mango is Assistant Professor of History at Virginia State University, where she currently advises the History Club and Campus Curls, Inc., and she was a Ph.D. student at Morgan State University in the heart of Baltimore and teaching at Baltimore County Community College during the uprising over the police murder of Freddie Gray. Jessica Piper, an honors English teacher at Maryville High School in Missouri, teaches the history of slavery through American literature using the framework Teaching the Hard History, having studied with the National Endowment for the Humanities. And John Paul Wilson, Adjunct Assistant Professor of Humanities at Virginia Union University and HBCU in Richmond, has collaboratively taught the history of the Civil Rights era as part of Learning Community Cluster, which was also part of a National Endowment for Humanities grant. I'm David Hamilton Golland, Professor of History and Coordinator of Humanities at Governors State University, a regional teaching institution in Chicago Southland, and I will serve as the moderator for today's discussion. And now I would turn it over to Dr. Arnold, who will kick it off with a few minutes from his perspective.
Okay. Thank you, Professor Golland. Thank you to the rest of the panel and to those watching or listening. I first began my involvement with this movement around its inception. And it seems like, even though it was only about 7 years ago, it seems like eons. In the wake of the acquittal of George Zimmerman for the murder of Trayvon Martin, this movement emerged, and I participated in a demonstration in my community, and there were thousands of us wearing hoodies or hooded sweatshirts. And as you recall, this was George Zimmerman's justification for his murder of Trayvon Martin in Florida. He was wearing a hoodie. He was out at night. He was Black. Some demonstrators also carried the snacks that Trayvon Martin had carried. So that's where my involvement with this movement begins. But in terms of teaching, in terms of placing this in a historical context, there are a couple of things to consider. One is that we're constantly asked to compare and contrast this movement with the mainstream civil rights movement. And obviously, it is part of this longer struggle for African American equality, African American for racial justice. But it's important to understand that Black Lives Matter um, is a very different kind of movement. It is a movement, but it is also an organizing strategy, employing different techniques and tactics that vary from place to place and from time to time. Um, in addition, it is also a movement, or in terms of its organization, that has not been as hierarchical as Dr. Golland mentioned during his introduction. The organizational structure is more grassroots, more um, uh, horizontal rather than vertical, not hierarchical, and that is in direct contrast to organizations like the NAACP, the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, and other major players, other major organizations in the modern civil rights movement. It also strikes me that this movement, although Black-led, is a lot more diverse, including that is including Latinx people, indigenous people, whites, and Asians, Asian Americans, and also individuals, members of the communities that have been excluded. For example, LGBTQ people. And this has given this movement a more intersectional quality than I believe the civil rights movement. The movement, I think now, and I think is becoming more organized, becoming more formalized in a way that it was not when it was beginning. And in some ways, this is how organizations or movements evolve. I would also, in addition to looking at the civil rights movement, think about, or ask us to think about, seeing this as a modern abolition movement, or looking at the parallels with the abolition movement, in terms of being broad-based, in terms of at least for some of the goals of this movement, the abolition of the police, the abolition of the prison industrial complex. Again, this is not these views are perhaps not held by everyone within this movement, but also taking on different characteristics depending on time and place, and both in the civil rights movement and in the abolition movement, there were wide differences of opinion as to the most effective strategies, the most effective tactics to follow, and you see this happening with this movement as well. So I'm not I'm a scholar of 20th century America, but certainly I think it's worthwhile to place this movement in context with the movement to abolish slavery. And one other thing, and you see elements of this both in the abolition movement and in the civil rights movement, is that the Black Lives Matter movement has gone global, especially in this past year, where protest either in solidarity with Black Lives Matter protesters in the United States have occurred across the globe. And also Black Lives Matter protesters in Australia, Western Europe, Latin America, utilizing the tactics, the theories of the Black Lives Matter movement to address specific issues in those countries. And I think it's also very important. I think a lot of our students will get this. This is a movement that begins through social media in a way that these previous movements simply do not have a more gradual genesis and evolution. So that's all I have to say to begin with. So I thank you and look forward to this discussion.
Thank you, Dr. Arnold. And without further ado, I would ask Dr. Mango to turn on her camera and share some things with us.
Yes. So teaching African American history in the Black Lives Matter era at historically Black colleges and universities. This is my second tenure track job at a HBCU. And I must say that I have noticed a number of interesting developments. First of all, I would like to kind of discuss these developments within the context of what I call post-Obama pessimism. So what I see in this post-Obama pessimism at these HBCUs and teaching African-American history is a movement away from what used to be some very kind of reliable norms in the African-American community, i.e. aligning yourself with the Democratic Party, being immersed in Christian theology, and a number of other ideas that have been standard and commonplace in the African-American community for much time. And I believe that although, and I must preface this comment by saying I did have the pleasure of working in the Obama White House office as an intern for almost 3 years, but I believe that what I'm seeing at these HBCUs is it was a lot of hope and a lot of suspense that the Martin Luther King civil rights dynamic of just, if we just only vote, that will change the reality and make a grand change of the reality for the African-American community. I think that has, with Obama's presidency, and not African-Americans not feeling that they're at HBCUs, their students, not feeling that much changed. As a matter of fact, coming into contact with more protests and having a lot of police shootings and the rise of Black Lives Matter in the midst of the Obama presidency, this led to a pessimism that coupled with social media in the age of information on social media that has kind of transformed the conversations, transformed the way that I've had to teach and approach in class and answer my students' questions, even in reading their analysis, where their consciousness is in such, it's beyond the civil rights dynamic where if we just vote, our reality will change. No, it's a thirst for a systematic change that's rooted in systems, the same systems and institutions that binded African Americans. I find my students now looking at African American history and from a sense of systems. How can we promote systematic change? And what I mean by systematic change is not just corporations hiring Black people. The students are demanding systematic change. They want to know why they have to speak English. They want to know why and how they came to have the names that they have. Why and how who were they before they became African American? So they're asking very deep critical analysis questions, not just what is encompassed in this African American experience, but what is the African American experience? What is it comprised of? How did it come to be? Who was I? Who am I? And who was I before I was an African American? How is the African American experience similar with other experiences, with the Jamaican experience, with the questions of identity? In particular, I'm finding in the Black Lives Matter that questions of identity, my students at HBCUs are really questioning, having deep probing questions. Who am I? What am I? What would I have been if I had not been enslaved? So these type of questions are demonstrating to me that it's a collective consciousness that's happening, a collective wokeness, okay, as that's associated with this Black Lives Matter movement, this woke movement, where it is a certain type of consciousness that's not just around politics, not just around socio-cultural identity, but also health, hair, clothing, a push for Black owned. And so I see this movement actually away from this conservatism of the civil rights movement, the Black conservatism that kind of defines much of HBCUs because they are very conservative institutions, but moving more towards a Black nationalist and a Pan-Africanist ideology. Whether or not they say that, they might not say that, but that's exactly what they're doing. They're moving away from this notion of just being in concert with mainstream political norms, and they're moving towards a pro-Blackness, where this red, black, and green. Who would ever thought that the congressman and kente cloth would become mainstream, when that was seen at one time, particularly with conservative Blacks at HBCUs, that was seen as a little bit too radical. That was seen as a little bit too African. That was seen as a little bit too Afrocentric. But I'm seeing that now. I'm seeing HBCU presidents and graduation robes and stuff at HBCUs have these type of motifs, these red, black, and green flags. So Pan-Africanism. So what I'm saying is I was describing a new environment that I'm seeing. And this new environment, I find, is largely not only centered on the fact that we have the rise in Black Lives Matter, but because as a historian and as an African-American history professor, I'm also competing with the ideas that my students get from social media. So they're going home and studying social media history, documentaries, and getting history off social media memes and gifts and all of these various ways that they come in contact with historical information, some of it factual, some of it myth, some of it just propaganda. But nevertheless, all of that is making them come to me with an air of suspense. Like, am I actually down? Am I here to teach them these so-called, to continue to brainwash them as they believe that they're learning from YouTube scholars? They have no formal training. They're becoming their history teachers. People that might have been in prison and never graduated high school, who all of a sudden have a camera and a YouTube following. This is in our social media following, and they're getting their history from these people. So it's making my classroom more intense because I'm now being questioned and probed with more intense questioning, as if, what side am I on? It's almost like I have to pick a side. Am I on the side? It's almost like I've become the professors. For me, it's almost like a part of the elite class. And am I actually down with the struggle? And I think that this might be because HBCUs are being embraced by major politicians. And so now so HBCUs are in the social media context with these street scholars, self-trained scholars, are becoming more seen as bourgeoisie institutions. So the students are demanding more. They want more authenticity in their African American experience. So what I would say is I see a more active and vibrant history than when I was a student at an HBCU. I see a more revolutionary pedagogy that's having to form. I see a decentralization of Christianity, real questions about religion, real questions about God, real questions about norms. I see a desire for a solution-based history, not just a history that's history for the sake of history, but a history that is big and bold and courageous and solution-based. So not just that we're studying facts, historical facts, but how can these historical facts transform my reality? So I see a movement towards, at the same time, more pride in HBCUs, because now in retrospect, we have the benefit of seeing what Black institutions was able to sustain themselves, sustain whites against all of these acts of white supremacy and white aggression. And one of them that has emerged victorious are HBCUs. HBCUs have emerged as the victors in many ways in African American history. So in that, our students are being more critical of the education that they're receiving at HBCUs. They want more Black professors. They want a more Black curriculum. They're demanding more. Unfortunately, HBCUs don't have a lot of African American studies programs, believe it or not. It's only one African American studies graduate program at an HBCU, and that's at Morgan State, where I completed my PhD. And so not even at Howard do they have a graduate studies program in African American studies. They have African studies, but they don't have a graduate, they have undergrad, but not. So it's a demand for HBCUs to not just be conservative, but to be transformative. They're questioning, why do we have Black Greek societies? Why do we not have African fraternal societies at our universities? And these questions have been raised before. So as I conclude, these questions have been raised before. Now, what, in the 1970s, during the Black Power movement, during the rise of Afrocentricity and so forth in the 1980s. So these questions have been raised before, but what I think the Black Lives Matter era and teaching African American history in the Black Lives Matter era, what I think is different about when the questions were asked before, these same questions that were asked previously about Black nationalism and PanAfricanism, these type of ideologies that were outside of the mainstream, when they were asked before, they were asked as if they were on the fringe. But now I'm finding that these questions are being asked and put at the forefront as possible solutions, because to dealing with issues of Black depravity, almost insistence that nothing is ever going to change. It's almost like a hope that, well, we need to be looking for other options. But I do see in this nexus, I do see a lot of departures between the way that these same questions were asked in the 1970s and the way they're asked now, because of issues of LGBT issues. So you might have a lot of the Black conscious stalwarts, progenitors who, like the Nation of Islam and things of that sort, where the students are not necessarily gravitating towards these same type of institutions because of LGBT issues, because of their notion they want to be inside of a new age type of religion. They want to define their own spirituality. They don't want to be inside of that. And also it's a departure because of women's issues. They see these institutions as male-centered and dominated by men, and they're unwilling to take a back seat to the men to let them lead. So we see an assertion of women, and we have a heavy layer of feminism that is accompanying these questions in this Black Lives Matter era at HBCUs, which is kind of showing the institutional divide between the way that these same more radicalism was radical Black consciousness, Black nationalism in the 1970s was raised, and the way it's raised today during the Black Lives Matter era. And I think that those are the main issues that divide these two eras in history. So as I conclude, what I would like for the audience to walk away with is, from my perspective, teaching Black African American history in the Black Lives Matter era at historically Black colleges, I see a renewed pride in HBCUs, not just from students, but across the spectrum. But I see a new desire to ensure that the HBCU education is more reflective of the actual realities on the ground, the actual energy that Black Lives Matter brings with it. So I see the students holding the professors and the administrators more accountable for moving in a more radical direction, moving in a less conservative era. And I also see this happening amid, and I don't think it's a coincidence. I think these two issues are related, that this change, this radicalism is coming right after America seen its first Black president, because I think that the hope and the change that in the energy and the desire that if we move towards just a more civil rights, let's just vote, that's the way to bring about change. I think that it's a malaise that accompanies that with the students, and so they are now moving towards a more inward. They're turning inward versus depending on external institutions like the church, but rather a turn inward, more self-reliance, more Black nationalism, more Pan-Africanism. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Mango. And as with most of our listeners, I'm sure I'm starting to get lists and lists of questions now that I've heard two of the presenters speak. And so with that, let's go, but I'm going to hold my questions against my own my own inclination to burst out with them. And we'll move on to Ms. Piper, who will be next. And I'll ask Dr. Mango to turn off her camera, her video. Thank you. Ms. Piper?
It says I can't start it because you stopped it.
Oh, let me fix that then.
Okay.
Did that do it?
Yes, it did.
Great.
Thank you. My name is Jessica Piper. I'm a rural high school teacher in Missouri, and I teach 11th grade American literature to honor students in Maryville. My journey to teaching the history of slavery through literature was a little bit different. I was born in Louisiana, moved to Mississippi. I grew up most of the time in Arkansas. I grew up very poor, going to public schools. And in my public schools, I never learned anything about Black history, African Americans. I learned that the Civil War was because of states' rights, because of Northern aggression. And by golly, what else would we do than fight back? Slavery was a blip on the radar, as I remember in history. I went to college at the University of Arkansas at Fort Smith, and I saw a course that was African American history. And I thought, well, that sounds interesting. And so I took it, and the professor was a white guy. I had no Black professors until I was in graduate school. But he was really passionate about what he was talking about. We were in Arkansas. I learned things that I had never heard before. And I started thinking, he posed a question to us, how many Black authors have you read? I was a reader. I have a degree in English, and I could think, Toni Morris and maybe a couple others, but it really struck me that I didn't know what I didn't know. And after that point, I really started delving into African American history, though I'm a literature teacher. I get a lot of pushback on that too. Like, don't teach this, you're a literature teacher. But I knew that just from reading, I didn't know everything I needed to know. So I started studying with the National Endowment for the Humanities. I went to New York and I studied about slavery in the colonies. And let me tell you, people even in New York didn't know there was slavery in Westchester County, because that's where I was. I went through a mansion tour, and the guy giving the tour said, "No, you're mistaken. There was never slavery in Westchester County." And I was like, "Well, that's what I'm here to study." So I got my first glimpse at what was going on in the colonies. And the next year I studied in Georgia and Atlanta, and I studied slavery under the Constitution. And then I went to Mount Vernon and I studied slavery at Mount Vernon. And so with this sort of massive bump in my own education, I started really working with the kids. And I also go around the country and I teach other teachers. So I teach incorporating history, the history of slavery, into American Lit. And I have a quote to share from someone who he's created Teaching the Hard History. It's a framework for, I think it's K through 12. I'm pretty sure it may be 3 through 12, but it's Hassan Kwame Jeffries. And he says, slavery is a hard history. It's hard to comprehend the inhumanity that defined it. It's hard to discuss the violence that sustained it. It's hard to teach the ideology of white supremacy that justified it. And it's hard to learn about those who abided it. And I can tell you that's true. It is a hard history when you are in places like I am. My school's about 97% white. We're very rural. In my area, there's a lot of poverty. So I'm teaching poor white folks about history. And sometimes that's hard for people because they want to push back and say, well, poor white folks had it bad too. And of course they did, but it wasn't because of the color of your skin. So what I'd like to share with you guys today is just real concrete ways for people like me, teachers like me, that you can go out and talk about Black Lives Matter and place it historically, even within your American literature classes. So on my whiteboard, I have a timeline because I teach literature in a linear fashion like you would in history. So we start with pre-colonial with indigenous people, and then we go all the way through to postmodern. And so on my board, I have 1619. When we get to that era, when I start talking about William Bradford, then I talk about the fact, this is the time when people were first arriving here as enslaved people. And then we keep reading our literature and we get to the Civil War. And I talk about the fact that, I bring up obviously authors, Uladad, Equiano, and several others before we get to the Civil War. But then we talk about Frederick Douglass and his experience. And then the next one is Reconstruction. And then we go down and we have Jim Crow and Black codes, and we have civil rights, and then modern day BLM. And no one has a problem with this timeline until I get to BLM. And that's where, as a public school educator, I have a lot of pushback on that. But as long as you are well educated in your topic, it's pretty easy to be able to talk about things that are truthful. I talk about the fact that slavery was central to the economy, that that not just Southern people, but that Northern people were using enslavement to create wealth for themselves, that it was central to the economy. At this time, I also bring in the 1619 project, and that's a tough go in places where I am right now, because there has been a massive pushback on the 1619 project, and that's come down to even state levels where I have state representatives right now that are pre-filing bills for patriotic education. And what they're wanting to do is to push out legislation to say that basically you can't teach slavery. It needs to go back to where it was before, and we need to talk about the revolution and things like that. And I'm just like, we're already talking about the revolution. You don't have to pass legislation to do that. We all know what your true intent is. I talk about how our founding documents, the slavery was protected under the Constitution in more than one place. I talk about the fact that Thomas Jefferson he enslaved many people, that George Washington enslaved many people. I talk about the fact that the great emancipator, Abraham Lincoln, was not an abolitionist. And in fact, when you look at his writings, which I share with my students, you can see that he had some really racist thoughts. And it's not that I want my students to walk away going, I hate Jefferson. It's the fact that you have to understand that our founders were people, and that some of them did things that were really wrong. And if you put people on pedestals, they'll probably fall off. I talk about slavery as an institution of power, but the best part, I think, that a lot of kids don't get is the resistance to slavery. And I sprinkle that everywhere. From Nat Turner to, Denmark, BC, I put that out there for the kids to understand. Hey, it wasn't just, enslaved people that were like, it's my lot in life. They fought back consistently, always. And when we talk about emancipation, you want to say, well, they had been working for this for, hundreds of years. It wasn't just that Abraham Lincoln, hey, here you go, And I also talk about the fact, because my kids come into my class thinking that still in 2021, that the Civil War was about states' rights. And the easiest way for me to show kids that that is not true is to talk about the South Carolina Articles of Secession and say, this is what they said. They said they seceded because of slavery, because they weren't allowed to hold people in bondage anymore. We moved from that and we started talking about lynchings. And I'm very careful not to show brutalized Black bodies in my classroom. That's not my place. It's not the space for that to happen. But like Clint Smith has a fantastic poem that's called How to Make a Cardboard Box Disappear in 10 Steps. And he talks about police violence against unarmed Black people. And this was before George Floyd. So many names could be on there, but that one, really hits the kids. And also, the history of the town that I teach in Maryville in 1931. A Black man was lynched by a white mob. Thousands of people saw what happened. They chained him to a schoolhouse and set the schoolhouse on fire while thousands of people watched it. And that lynching wasn't being taught in the town that it happened in. And I thought, if you guys don't know your history, no one's going to know this history. To this date, there's never been anyone prosecuted or even charged for that crime. And there's been no apologies made for that crime. And I talk about white privilege, and I think that's a space that people like me really need to fill. I was born very poor. I didn't have food in instances. I didn't get to go on field trips because I was too poor. I couldn't join the Brownies because my mom couldn't afford the uniform. But I always tell the kids, I have privilege with everything in life, that could be held against me. One thing that never was is the color of my skin. And so I think that's really important to get across to high schoolers as well. So my version of teaching BLM is getting them to that point. And then I'm in the state that Ferguson happened in. So I'm in the northwest part of Missouri. I have kids whose parents were in the National Guard who were sent over there. So it's a touchy subject for sure. But I have to tell you that 16 and 17-year-old kids crave the truth, and they crave knowing how to right an injustice. And so I have occasionally, every single year, I have students that'll say, slavery was awful, but it didn't have anything to do with me. I didn't do anything, I shouldn't feel guilty about it. And I always explain, you shouldn't feel guilty about it. You're right, you didn't enslave anybody, but you didn't cause global warming either. You're the one who has to live with it and has to fix it. It's with racial injustice until my kids know that they have to address these issues, that nothing's going to get better until they do something about it. There's nothing that can be done. But I hope to empower my rural, sometimes often poor, white kids to walk out of my room and think, I can do something about this injustice that's happening in the world. And in Maryville last summer, in this very white community, we had a Black Lives Matter protest that I attended, and I was able to read Clint Smith's poem. And we had 400 people show up to march around this tiny little town around the courthouse in honor of someone who was brutally murdered by police. And so I think if we can make these incremental movements in tiny little rural communities like mine, I think we can do big things. And so that's what I do.
Thank you so much, Ms. Piper. And we'll now turn it over to Dr. Wilson.
Good afternoon, everybody. My name is John Paul Wilson, and I'm an adjunct instructor in history at Virginia University in Richmond, Virginia. In the fall semester of 2015, I became involved in a learning communities cluster in fulfillment of a National Endowment of the Humanities grant awarded to Virginia Union University to further the development and teaching of African American studies at that institution. I regularly taught the African American history, the American history 2-semester sequence survey courses, but I had never delved into the specific African American history subset as I was approached to do. The project seemed challenging, but the dedication and commitment of the project director and her commitment to a multidisciplinary endeavor had intrigued me. Dr. Luminita Dragulescu, an authority on Black American literature and culture in the English department at Virginia Union, have proposed the idea of creating a learning communities cluster at the university as a means of providing a more well-rounded and interdisciplinary approach to teaching African American history and culture to advanced students at the school. Learning community clusters are faculty groups that create content-related courses that are designed to be taught from 2 or more academic perspectives to provide a more interdisciplinary and collaborative experience between students and faculty, resulting in a deeper and more diverse mastery of a given subject. The project was designed to span several semesters, covering various aspects of African American history and culture, from slavery to the era of Black Lives Matter. But I was responsible for teaching a history of the American Civil Rights era that corresponded to a similar course focusing on the literature of the period. Dr. Dragulescu herself was my partner in this effort, and together we provided our students a rich academic experience that went beyond what could be gained from a single discipline. By the time the semester began in August of 2015, I had approximately 15 students who had registered for my LCC course, History of the American Civil Rights Era, and Dr. Dragulescu's co-relational LCC course, Literature of the Civil Rights Era at the same time. Mine took place in the early afternoons on Tuesdays and Thursdays, while hers took place a little later on the same days. The students were first presented with the more important events related to the Civil Rights Era, the aftermath of the Civil War and Reconstruction, resulting in Jim Crow and segregation, the emergence of early civil rights figures such as Booker T. Washington, W.E.B. Du Bois, as well as early organizations such as the NAACP and the Urban League. World War I and World War II, which brought about the Great Migration and the eventual desegregation of the American military. And finally, the Scottsboro case, the murder of Emmett Lewis Till, in Brown versus Board of Education, that sparked the creation of the formal civil rights movement as most historians recognize it, giving rise to Rosa Parks, Martin Luther King Jr., and organizations such as the SCLC and SNCC that would bring the civil rights era to a conclusion in the mid to late 1960s. Those same days, the students then studied the literature of the period with works such as W.E.B. Du Bois' The Souls of Black Folk, Martin Luther King Jr.'s Letter from a Birmingham Jail, Malcolm X and Alex Haley's The Autobiography of Malcolm X, and Lorraine Hansberry's A Raisin in the Sun. The history of the civil rights era would help create a foundation or context for the literature that students had to study. And the literature would then reinforce and enrich their understanding of the events they initially learned about. This led to a greater mastery of the students over the subject matter than would have been possible if in one discipline alone, and resulted in a positive and memorable experience for everyone involved. To reach that point, however, there was much advanced preparation and regular interaction between the faculty involved. During the summer prior to the start of the fall 2015 semester, I had to familiarize myself with instructional material related to the history of the civil rights era. As I had mentioned, I had never delved quite this deeply into the area of African American history, so I needed a lot of guidance as to what would be the most appropriate use what sources would be most appropriate to use in my course. Fortunately, I was able to rely on my colleagues who were involved in the Learning Communities Cluster. And through their help, I was able to navigate through these uncharted waters. We would all meet at various intervals throughout the summer and even into the fall semester, discussing our objectives, defining parameters, and encouraging each other to push the boundaries of what we could accomplish in the classroom. With the help from Dr. Raymond Hilton, our senior historian and fellow participant in the Learning Communities Cluster, I was able to decide on Sean Dennis Cashman's African Americans and the Quest for Civil Rights as the main textbook for my history of the civil rights era course. It had the breadth I was looking for in terms of expanding the area of focus from the late 19th century to the early decades of the 21st century, but still concentrated on key events that took place during the 1950s and 60s. From there, I looked to Dr. Dragulescu, as well as our wonderful research librarian, for shorter readings related to actual historical actors who were at the center of the events. Sarah Marin, the said historian, had gone to the trouble of putting together an entire library guide for those involved in the Learning Communities Cluster that included books, articles, and videos that I could use in the classroom to really make the civil rights era come alive for my students. Through the efforts of others, I was able to put together a course that centered around lectures, discussions, and even student presentations. And I could not have done this without the help of my colleagues in the Learning Communities Cluster. Once the semester was underway, I would meet regularly with my immediate academic partner, Dr. Dragulescu, to gauge how we both thought our classes were going. And through these periodic meetings, we were able to get a better sense of what was working and what wasn't. There were times she would let me know that our students needed some clarification on some aspect of the civil rights era history. And likewise, I let her know when I felt that a little more time could be spent on some piece of the literature. This back and forth interaction really pushed us both to challenge our students as well as our own perceptions of the material. And it really enhanced what we were both doing. At the end of the semester, we threw a pizza party for our students. And it was then that we both got a sense of just how rewarding the whole experience had been for everyone involved. The Learning Communities Cluster continued for a few more semesters with new faculty members getting involved and developing new courses relating to African American history and culture. My direct involvement ended at the close of the fall 2015 semester, but I still attended meetings to discuss my past experiences in the project. Dr. Dragulescu and her ever-evolving team eventually fulfilled the grant, and Virginia Union University has been better for it. In the fall semester of 2019, I was approached by Dr. Tedritter, the chair of our newly formed Department of Humanities, about teaching the second half of a two-sequence African American history survey. He had also been a member of the Learning Communities Cluster, bringing his expertise to the field of political science, to the subject of African American history and culture. And he felt that my earlier participation focusing on the civil rights era would be of value to the students wanting to learn more about African American history from Reconstruction to the present. The Learning Communities Cluster had indeed given me access to perspectives on African American history and culture that I wouldn't have had otherwise. And I was able to bring those experiences with me as I entered the classroom to teach a more traditional history of African Americans. My course still focused a great deal on the civil rights era, but from that narrower focus, I was able to branch out more easily to include things like the sharecropper experience, the Harlem Renaissance, and even the rise of hip hop. As of this past semester, I have been able to transform this class into an asynchronous online course, but it wouldn't have had the breadth or the depth if it were not for the experience that I had in the Learning Communities cluster. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you so much, Dr. Wilson, and I'll ask Dr. Arnold and Dr. Mango and Ms. Piper to turn their cameras back on to get to the roundtable portion of the roundtable. And I guess I'll start it off. And I certainly by no means want to sort of take this over with my own scholarly interests, which have been truly piqued by all of the things that you all have been talking about. But in particular, when Dr. Mango was talking about the newfound use of kente cloth at HBCUs, it just occurred to me, I'm at an institution where currently our president is African American, the chief of our police force is African American, and the director of commencement is African American, and the three of them I'm sorry, I shouldn't say the three of them unanimously, because she's a new president, but there had been a policy that African American graduates were not allowed to wear kente cloth at commencement. And it was, I thought it was a silly policy, but I'm not going to be the one to speak up as the white professor, arguing for the kente cloth at commencement. But as a student of African American conservatism, which is what I focus on in my scholarship, and African American Republicans, that's an interesting side of the HBCU experience that I hadn't really thought about.
Yes. Well, it is quite interesting, and that's been one of the criticisms of HBCUs. Believe it or not, out of over 100 HBCUs, only 5 of them are named after Black people. The majority of them are named after white because that's who funded them. So yes, they tend to be very conservative institutions because they're always under the thumb of white society. That's who they get their funding from. That's who the accreditation boards oftentimes and stuff. So they have not been very Afrocentric.
Yeah, I think about the United Negro College Fund board, and now the executive directorship has typically been held by African American men, but the board has had people on it like Morris Abram, former president of Brandeis University, people from the Rockefeller Foundation, people from the Ford Foundation, right? Very much.
President Bush was a board member of the UNCF, and it wasn't until 1970 that the UNCF had, I think, its first Black president or director of the board. They had to take it back from the white people who ran it from when it initially started on Tuskegee.
Vernon Jordan was executive director around that time.
Right, Vernon Jordan was the first Black executive director of that era. So that's why I said it's a lot of similarities between. It was a push for a more Black turn during the 1970s. They had to fight to get the UNCF. The Black leaders had to fight to get control of the board then. And so we see the same thing kind of happening now, but it's coming, I would argue, it's coming more from the students versus just a top-down approach. It's coming from a bottom-up approach.
And it's the politics of respectability, ultimately.
Yes.
It's about adopting white culture as a sense of self-protection during an era of Jim Crow, right?
Exactly.
And a continuing era of Jim Crow, which is the topic of our conversation, right?
Exactly. Exactly. And so it's also about the making of an African American. What HBCUs have had to do is essentially turn the formerly enslaved into African Americans, from Negroes into what is now African Americans. And that process has been a very, that involves a lot of push and pull with different, how you shape people's hearts and minds. And so That has also been one of the issues, is how do we assert ourselves as successful Blacks? And so the making of an African American did come with this kind of Victorian white standard, Black elitism and stuff, to demonstrate that Black people, the respectability politics, that Black people were just as capable of being, of living. I think the standard was that we're not white, but we can demonstrate that we can assert ourselves and act like that. It was almost like a rule of thumb.
Very much so. And I think about the founders of the NAACP and the National Urban League, also interracial, but primarily white leadership in the early years, right? And yet another connection with the HBCU historical experience. Other thoughts, folks? I'll tell the audience that I specifically asked all of our panelists to not leave their mute buttons on, so that we could have a very, very much a conversational feel about during the remainder of our time, to really try to replicate a roundtable type of atmosphere that we would have at the OAH if we were indeed in Chicago, as we had originally planned. So folks, get in there and have at it, as it were. Let's converse.
Miss Piper, nice to meet you. I'm also a fellow Louisianian. You can.
Nice to meet you.
Yes, but I find it was so interesting. I enjoyed all of your presentations, but particularly I enjoyed yours because I was thinking about my experience as a Black professor teaching majority Black students at a Black institution, and the level of freedom that we have to engage with the African American reality. Whereas it seems that, in your positions, like you're trying to you have to kind of explain. It's like you have to kind of make African American history palatable for your audience. So it's interesting, and tying it in with Dr. Paul Wilson's community clusters, teaching clusters. It's almost like we would be having different perspectives because of the different audiences and the different exposure and the different realities of the African American experience for the particular audiences. So I don't know if you would like to speak more to that, but it seems like you almost have to kind of curtail, and it's almost like you have to kind of coax, and you have to be really cautious as to how you teach and approach this topic. Whereas, I guess I take for granted that I don't, that my students are coming in and, with Malcolm X shirts and this, that, and the other.
How nice.
So.
Yeah, it is. And honestly, I've put my job in danger a lot. I just received tenure. Thank you, Jesus. I can talk now. But you're right, Dr. Mango. I'm in a position. The thing about me is that I'm used to going against the grain, and I'm okay with that. But honestly, in this area of the world, it's not like that. There was a whole lot of pushback in the beginning, but as people just realized, oh, she's a liberal, she's going to talk about these things. But I tell you, once this summer happened with George Floyd, that inflamed things, and what just happened a couple days ago in the Capitol has made my job very difficult. Most of the teachers I know in my area were sent letters telling us to not speak of what happened in the Capitol. And that's what we've lived under. And it is different in the K through 12 world than it is, in higher education. Parents are very aware, and especially I teach face-to-face 5 days a week with full classes. Thank God we have a mask mandate. But there are other teachers in my position that are teaching on Zoom, and parents are very aware of the lessons, and they're hearing lessons, and so they're even more mindful of what they're saying. I'm so appreciative of of what you guys do when they get to higher ed, and how you do have a little more freedom. But it's tough at K through 12. It's tough.
I just want to interject for our viewers who are probably watching this in early April, that it is January 10th as we record this. It is the Sunday after the Capitol was stormed by pro-Trump protesters, rioters, folks, and President Biden has not yet been inaugurated. And we hope, as you're hearing this, it's a more peaceful time in America, frankly. In fact, ideally, as you hear this, we hope that all of our problems are solved and we have a truly egalitarian society after 100 days of Kamala Harris in the vice presidency. But I don't actually think anyone on this panel expects that to be the case, because we're too knowledgeable about history. So back to you all. Yes, don't raise your hand. Just get in there.
Okay, just get in there. Yeah, I'm in a situation where it's a little bit of both of your situations, Ms. Piper and Dr. Mango. NIU is a relatively racially diverse institution. It's majority white, but that majority is declining. We have a large Latinx population and we have a large Black population. We draw, for the most part, within a 3-hour driving radius of the institution, which means Chicagoland, which means we have students who are from Chicago, from some of the inner ring suburbs, from some of the outer ring suburbs, and also from rural areas that I can tell you tend to be somewhat conservative. A student once said that in one of my classes, the Civil War was not worth one American life. It was the one day I was not there. And apparently there was my TAs handled it well, but there was quite a discussion. So vigorous discussion. So with that being said, I've noticed that in the past year, since the killing of George Floyd, students across the board have become more aware and somewhat more radicalized. Perhaps this is we're teaching 100% online, at least I am. But I've noticed this, and I've been kind of surprised that these are students of all races, all ethnicities, and Ms. Piper, I had a question about the Maryville lynching. If I go to Maryville today, is there a marker for that?
No, sir.
Okay.
There's nothing. I contacted the EJI, Equal Justice Initiative, and they were aware. The man's name was Raymond Gunn, and he was accused of raping and killing a white school teacher. It was very tragic, and they knew exactly it was going to happen, and they kind of just stood back and let it happen. But to get the process moving, it can't just be me. I need my community behind me. I also need the community to make an apology. And so far, that hasn't happened. And every year I introduce it to my students and say, would you be interested in maybe working towards this? And we haven't been able to do anything yet. And I am just a school teacher. I wish that there was somebody on the city council that was interested in making an apology. And there should be a marker there. And what's there right now is a little sign that says Garrett Schoolhouse. And it said former site of Garrett Schoolhouse. It doesn't say the schoolhouse was burned down with a Black man on top of it. And it's awful that it's happened and that it's gone on this long and that people refuse to deal with it.
Yeah, here's the thing, but prior to entering academia, I worked in the museum field. I was the director of education, later archivist at Philadelphia's Afro-American Historical and Cultural Museum. And I was also on the Black History Advisory Committee of the Pennsylvania Historical and Museum Commission. And I currently teach courses in public history. And this is this is not surprising because there has been a struggle on the part of some to keep this history hidden, specifically any kind of public acknowledgement of these atrocities. But let me think of some resources in Missouri that could be helpful.
Thank you.
And it's difficult in a state like Missouri, and also I would say basically Kentucky, Delaware, Maryland, and the states that had slavery but did not even go through the Reconstruction process. So you never had in some cases, these 4 states, there was never a clear any sort of reckoning. I believe. Like
The border states.
Thanks.
And one thing that I would also like to point out is I also see a bit more of scrutiny from my students in particular, of PWIs, of just the ivory tower and just education, the way African American history is taught, just institutional racism in education. So I think that this Black Lives Matter era is also spawning questions about how African American history is taught, where it's taught, just institutional racism at various institutions, you know, and for me, you know, being at an HBCU during this era, it's interesting because HBCUs students are feeling a renewed sense of pride in their education because their HBCUs never discriminated against Black people, you know, maybe with skin color, but so I also see that as well. I see a renewed interest in critiquing how and where African American history is taught at, and stuff. So, and how it's taught. So I think that Black Lives Matter is making I never thought my degree in African American history would be so so warranted or so, but it's really, they raised the stakes for me. I'm feeling real, you know, I see engineers, I'm like, okay, yeah, you're an engineer, I'm African American history. So, you know, it's really raised the stakes for the field as well, you know, so I like that. I don't know about your experiences as well. Do you see a renewed interest in just in African American history in general? Do you see people wanting to study it and learn it more because of Black Lives Matter and stuff?
John Paul, what's been your experience? You're also at an HBCU.
I mean, as far as
what Dr. Mango was just,
yeah, I mean, there's all kinds of different perspectives, and you know, depending on, you know, the professor, and yeah.
Now,
I'm sorry.
No,
as a
please.
high school teacher, it's not, at least in our curriculum, African American history is not in our curriculum. There is American history, and if you have a teacher who feels like they know enough, they will, you know, go in and teach it. But I think that a push down from the top and pushing this down into at least the high school level would really further the causes in colleges. I know I graduated with an all white school in rural Arkansas, with no knowledge and no reading, and I had nothing. And so I think pushing it down, which is my goal, is to tell people we should be teaching this history. I'm not sure why we're not. Um, I think that that would be effective, and that way at least kids come to you knowing that the Civil War was about slavery. That would probably be a good start.
Question
Yeah.
for Ms. Piper. When you went to New York and had all of your additional training, and then you came back to your school in order to put your classes together, were there colleagues or other people that helped mentor you? Because I know in my particular situation, I really relied on people that had different types of expertise and areas that I did not. But was this something that you relied on, once you came back from that experience?
No, there was immediate pushback, immediate. Once I established myself as a scholar, I do this and I study and I research and I study with Black scholars who teach me the history, then it was more acceptable. But it was a process of a couple of years. I had, a history teacher just flat out tell me I was wrong. And so I'm not a history teacher, I'm a literature teacher. But that means that I can read the literature of our country's founding. I can read articles of secession and understand what they said. So it's very difficult to be in a high school, and try to assert yourself. As you guys all have advanced degrees, I have a master's degree, which, I'm not being self-deprecating, but it is where you have to say, I've studied with scholars. I study with Black scholars. Um, you know,
And we have control over our curriculum. At least,
you do. You do.
Well,
I have a board of education, yeah, that tells me what I should teach.
right.
I think what's also interesting, I can talk about it from the perspective of a graduate student, because I went to Louisiana Tech University, which is very conservative, very white. I was the only Black student for my master's degree, and the focus there is Southern history. And then I went to Morgan, which was a HBCU, for my PhD. And I mean, just the level of discussion on matters pertaining just to the readings, the level of discussion, the focus was just so different. The reception, I mean, Morgan, we were able to, I was in a class with 12 future Black PhDs in African American history, whereas when I was at Louisiana Tech, I was the only Black student, and it was a struggle for me, because uh, the faculty and the students weren't quite ready to engage with the literature in the same way and grapple with the history in the same way. It was almost a facade that was up. And it had the spatial difference between the history and the reality, and it was a very conservative approach to history. We might have touched on slavery a little bit and here and there, but it was not like at Morgan where we were able to just really just unravel and just get to, like, I felt so free and liberated being able to engage and just have professors and that discussed the history and gave us the freedom to discuss history and expose us to readings and different perspectives than I was exposed to at Louisiana Tech. So it definitely makes a difference in terms of of how it's taught on the graduate level, how it's given on the graduate level. It makes a difference, and we all know this, and what type of scholar that is created. Because had I not went to Morgan, I probably wouldn't have felt so liberated to teach these students. I might have felt uncomfortable to teach students and deal with the level of discussion that they come into class with. So it's an interesting caveat for me.
Other thoughts?
I'll take this opportunity to say one last thing. Is that I really want to go back to the social media activism and the social media, the history on social media. I think that this is an area that is particularly, it could be positive, but it also could be dangerous for our students, because truth is becoming so difficult, elusive. It's becoming very fluid. And historians, we rely on facts, historical facts. Of course, we can challenge them and have different interpretations, but this social media, history on social media during this Black Lives Matter era, I think that students feel like they're being liberated, but sometimes they are just being miseducated. And it's become, I think it's going to be a lot more dangerous in the future. I'm not so sure. I analyzed this and I'm not so sure, particularly, I don't know if African Americans in particular were just now being exposed to their history and stuff. I don't know if being bombarded with all these different perspectives and stuff, and a lot of it is just not true. These different memes and stuff, it's actually making my job a bit more difficult in a way, because they come into the class with so many misconceptions about what actual history is. And so it's becoming, I think it's something that, as educators, we need to really be thinking about is, how do we grapple with this competing with social media? And and it can diminish our relevance in a way, because if you can get educated, you can listen to 19 hours of history, then then you come into the classroom and students might think, hey, I know more than you, which they might, but they might not have the methodological training that we have. So I think social media is something that should be very, very critically analyzed in terms of how history is perceived and how history is fomenting action. It's radicalizing people and stuff, and sometimes it's not even true what people are learning.
With social medias and a double-edged or multi-edged sword. For example, in my community, there is a memorial to those who have been killed by the police, and over the past few days, the city has been trying to take this memorial down. And so, I mean, as I said, I'm probably the oldest person. I'm definitely the oldest person on this panel. So it's, for me, it's it's like science fiction. Suddenly you get an alert to mobilize, to come down to this particular place and to protest. That certainly didn't happen with the same degree of immediacy in the past, going way back, not in the same way. But Dr. Mango, you're right in terms of social media as a source, and I think it's an ongoing process in terms of establishing for our students, teaching them what is real evidence, what has been gone through some kind of vetting or editing process, has gone through a critique, and is just on one hand, and on the other hand is just something that somebody has thrown up on social media. Okay, you're right. It does make our job more challenging, and I think it starts at the K through 12 level. And I've had students say, "Well, according to my research," or cite certain YouTube, and no, some sites are valid. Many are not, and so I mean, I think this is it's part of learning the craft of a historian, you will also see that with they also, not to the same extent, with the print media as well. Not everything you read in print is valid, has gone through an editing or vetting, some sort of vetting process.
So in a sense, it's just like any other tool that
Exactly.
It can be misused, and it has been misused. And I'm sure people were writing fake news in hieroglyphs.
Exactly.
And I think that's the value added that we bring as educators, right? It's that
Yes.
we ask our students to ask the tough questions. What do we call it? We call it interrogating your source, right?
Mm-hmm.
Literally,
Exactly.
students. I mean, I say to my students, literally, imagine you're on a law program like Law and Order, and your source is in the witness stand. What questions are you going to ask, to try to get at the truth? Other thoughts? We're about 7 or 8 minutes from an hour and a half, and I don't think OAH would mind if we go a little bit late. But let me throw this out there to all of you, and maybe just take turns. If you could answer in like one sentence or 2 sentences, one piece of advice today for fellow educators teaching African American history in this era, what would it be? Anyone want to go for it? We don't have to follow alpha.
I can go first. Mine for people at my level is to get educated themselves, because in our teaching programs we are not prepared to teach African American history. So we need to reach out to others who are smarter and better at this than we are, and learn it and then teach it. It's difficult, just to jump in. You really do need training.
I'll only correct you that professors are not necessarily smarter.
Lots are. Thank you.
Thank you for that. Others?
I would say to make yourself open to different types of expertise and as many points of view as you possibly can. And because I believe diversity is really the key to creating a well-rounded history, whether you're talking about African American history or anything else in general. You don't want to get incredibly myopic. You want, again, lots of different perspectives coming in to help you present that content to your students so that they understand the subject as completely as possible.
In a couple of sentences, I would just say that do not think of the African American community as a monolith. That we all share some experiences, but we have different perspectives. We come from different traditions, be they class, regional, religious, and for example, some of the founders of Black Lives Matter have roots. I mean, in terms of parentage in Africa and the West Indies, and it's important to understand that when we think of the African American experience, it now will includes those brothers and sisters in the African diaspora, wherever they're from. Okay, so I would say to understand and work to understand the diversity of the African American community.
And I would say that it's important to understand, one, that an African American had to be made, that this was a process, that this did not just arise by nature. It was a process, that the African American process, being an African American is a process. And that is measured largely and by the historical realities and consequences. And then secondly, I would say that it's important to see the African American experience as a small element, actually, of a longer African experience.
Exactly.
That this is a small glimpse, 400 years of, arguably, some people say 200,000 years, since the origin. If you look at what scientists say, that this is a part of a larger, a longer story that can have a different ending. And then lastly, I would say, ensure that you practice not just the decolonization of African American history, but also the decolonization of information in general when studying African American history. Studying African American history with an approach to decolonizing information in time to properly examine this group of people. So it's a multi-pronged process that involves a lot of decolonization.
Stanley Keith Arnold, Jessica Piper, Cheryl Mango, and John Paul Wilson. I know you all join me, David Golland, in thanking our audience for joining us on this very brief, but I think really enlightening discussion, teaching African American history in the Black Lives Matter era. If you are not a member of the Organization of American Historians, we very strongly urge you to join. And we look forward to the end of the pandemic when we can all be together in person once again. So thank you all for participating. Thank you all for listening.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks to everyone.